Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hannick here with co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes. Today, we'll discuss Thomism and South Africa. Context counts, so we'll also be talking about Catholicism in South Africa. We're very much looking forward to our first virtual visit to this beautiful and fascinating country. Our welcome guest is Professor Callum Scott. He teaches in the Department of Philosophy and, this is a new formulation for us, Practical and Systematic Theology at the University of South Africa. Scott is a permanent deacon in the Archdiocese of Pretoria. Let's, as we always do, begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may always be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Professor Scott, Callum, if we may, could you please tell us a bit about yourself and your background?
Thanks, James. If background is important and context is important, mine could probably fill a few books. I'm a first-generation South African. My parents came as immigrants to this country via long and winding paths. My mother from Scotland, through Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and eventually South Africa. And my dad was born in Kenya and lived between Kenya and the Seychelles and eventually came to South Africa. He was born of an English mother who was born in India and an Irish father, with his eldest sister born in Ireland, the next one born in England, and my dad in Kenya. So that's my family history. I was educated in Catholic schools and convent schools throughout my life. And so from the age of 4, and I was surrounded by Irish Dominican sisters who came in their numbers to this country from 1863. There are very few left now, as Ireland is kind of dried up from giving vocations to the world. But nevertheless, they taught us, and I was probably in the last generation that would have had a good number of sisters teaching in schools. I am a permanent deacon of the Archdiocese of Pretoria, as you said. That also comes with a whole bunch of responsibilities. I'm responsible for the formation of candidates to the diaconate in our diocese, and do other things apart from working in the parish. We have just concluded a synod, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later. Was working on the team of that. And of course, I work as a philosopher. I am a married deacon, so I have a wife and 2 daughters, one of 3 and one of 6, which it's fairly unusual, I suppose, to be a relatively young permanent deacon with young children. Not that common throughout the world, but there you go. And I've been working in the University of South Africa since 2009. I began as a associate lecturer and now reached professor in that time. We are in the situation of being a merged department, in fact 3 departments merged together, I guess in cost-cutting measures principally. philosophy used to be a department on its own, and systematic theology and theological ethics, as they call it, moral theology, used to be a department on its own, and practical theology, pastoral theology, was a department on its own. And the three were pushed together, so it became the Department of Philosophy, and then it should be practical and systematic theology, which might make a bit more sense. However, I'm only teaching philosophy currently in the university, and principally, as the next question says, philosophy of science, but also the history of Western philosophy to some postgrad students, and our postgrad philosophy of science course as well I teach. And I have a good number of masters and doctoral students as well who are doing various topics, but mostly relating to Thomism.
But not only do I not see you wearing many hats, why, blimey, you're not wearing a hat at all. And you're what I would call a hybrid.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to ask Mario to funnel our discussion right into philosophy.
Well, you said that you're a philosopher, but my question is, how did you decide to become a philosopher in this world?
Where did you go wrong?
By accident.
There are no accidents.
We don't believe in coincidences here.
I'd hope you wouldn't be such Calvinists, but anyway. I started my studies almost straight out of school to be a psychologist. I wasn't sure if it would be counseling or clinical psychology, and I needed a second major, and I was discerning the priesthood at the same time. So I thought, well, look and see what there was, and in our faculty at the University of Pretoria, where I was studying, theology was a faculty completely on its own, which is virtually owned by the Reformed churches. So it was a little bit not where I really wanted to be. And but philosophy was philosophy, and pretty run-of-the-mill, postmodern, continental philosophy. I didn't really know that at the time, because I would have been too young to realize any difference. But anyway, I needed a second major to my psychology, so I decided to take philosophy. And then when I finished my bachelor's degree, we have here in South Africa what's called the honors degree, which would be the fourth year of the bachelor's degree, I guess, in the US, before you go on to the master's. And I was trying to figure out what did I want to specialize in? Did I want to carry on with psychology or philosophy? And I liked both, so I was a bit confused. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's dead now, an Irish Dominican sister who had taught me in school, and she had a sister in her community who was a clinical psychologist. And as we were passing this sister's office, she just said to me, "I think you'd rather teach than be like that." Okay, but she'd known me for a long time, very long time, and so I thought about it, and then decided that I actually was more interested in philosophy, and especially in areas of science linking to philosophy. So in that last year of my honors degree in philosophy, I was able to take a few courses in psychology, cognitive psychology, which I was interested in, but then also philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, formal logic, and these sorts of things, which helped me then to do a research paper in St. Thomas and cosmology. And I guess that the reason I chose St. Thomas was not because St. Thomas was particularly popular in the university where I was studying. In fact, the university was, at that moment, deeply Nietzschean, deeply postmodern, very averse, in fact, to any other tradition. So I think by virtue of the strength of that, I figured out what I didn't like and found out where I felt at home. And I was fortunate enough at that point to be allocated an advisor for my study, who was a Calvinist minister, a Reformed minister, but who also specialized in medieval philosophy, because his branch of Calvinism still valued philosophy, unlike many of the others in South Africa. So he had a good background, and he was open to me doing research on St. Thomas. And he was a philosopher of science. Or is it? He's retired now, but he's also a philosopher of science, and especially a lot of his works are centered on evolutionary theory. So now, why did I decide to become a philosopher? That's why I decided to study philosophy, I think. But I was always fascinated by big questions, posing questions, and I think I was fortunate in the sense that being taught by Dominican women, they were never afraid to encourage us to ask questions, never afraid to let us probe as teenagers, probe them for answers to questions, to big questions. That in my experience, in any event, in secular schools, the politics might be too great for young people to be able to pose questions that might be upsetting, and that certainly wasn't the case for us. So I was interested in that. Eventually, the hybrid story gets a bit more complicated. When I finished my master's degree, I entered the Capuchin Franciscans. So I spent some years as a Capuchin, as a postulant, and at that time I was also teaching in the National Seminary here in Pretoria. Then I went to the novitiate and eventually discerned out of being a Capuchin after making simple profession. And then I needed a job, because the world needs money. I was fortunate at the time that a Capuchin had an NGO that it subsequently closed, which was engaged in interreligious dialogue, and particularly interreligious dialogue with between Christians and Muslims, and using the meeting of St. Francis and the Sultan in Damietta in Egypt as the key. So I worked there for about a year, and eventually there was an advert for a job at the university where I am teaching. And at that point, here in South Africa, to become a lecturer in a university, the minimum qualification would be a master's degree. So I had the master's degree. I had some teaching experience from the seminary, and so I was appointed to a very junior post to become a philosopher in a secular university, which has been an interesting journey, because throughout that time, I've never shied away from being a Catholic philosopher within that context, which can be quite tough at times and lonely, but yeah.
May I ask a question about that? When you say you never shied away from being a Catholic philosopher in a secular university, what do you mean by that?
What do I mean by being a Catholic philosopher in a secular university?
Right.
Here in Los Angeles, Callum, here in Los Angeles, that would require a bumper sticker on your door saying Rome rum, and rebellion.
Yeah. I think, like in many places around the world, philosophy in secular universities is not necessarily particularly open to faith. There's a degree of hostility, and I didn't really care, I suppose, about that hostility toward faith. Particularly when I started at the University of South Africa, we had quite a number of dyed-in-the-wool atheistic colleagues who would be now retired, but very much hostile to the idea of faith, seeing faith as the easy way out because you get all the answers, rather than understanding that choosing to be a philosopher with faith makes your life somewhat more complex if you are to both live as a philosopher and, in my case, as a Catholic. Of course, St. Thomas is a great help in that area. There's also the degree of to what extent in a secular institution do you demonstrate faith? Do you speak about it? Whether it's with colleagues or with students. Now, of course, one's not trying to proselytize in a secular institution. I wouldn't go here, for example. Deacons wear the collar. I didn't put the collar on. I wouldn't put the collar on the campus of the university because it's not a Catholic university. I think there are sensitivities that one has to have and respect for others and for other sensitivities. But as I've grown in the institution from being a junior colleague to being a professor with tenure and so on, I have become, let's say, a bit more confident in asserting what my particular religious beliefs are in a multi-faith but still secular country. So South Africa would be a country very tolerant of faith, for sure. Almost all people would profess some form of faith, and atheism would not be a very popular stance, and from an African perspective it would be almost an impossible stance to profess that I believe in nothing. It would be completely countercultural, although there is a rise, I think, as secularism from the West is having more of an influence in society, particularly through social media, television, and so on. The degree of secularism, secularity, and hostility toward faith would be on the rise, but at the same time, there's an interesting increase in Pentecostalism in South Africa. What I figured with this, speaking to a deacon from Brazil, is that we're actually in a fairly similar situation, where many people would be leaving more traditionally established churches and becoming Pentecostals. Part of it, I think, has to do with the gospel of prosperity, the promise in a situation of severe poverty in many cases, because our society is one of great contrasts. But then you ask, okay, so to be a Catholic philosopher in a secular university, maybe the more interesting part of it is not necessarily the type of philosophy that I do, because I suppose for most people that wouldn't be the interesting question. Maybe the interesting part would be how is one a Catholic in a secular university? And I've had people over these years, almost 15 years, come to me and say, what's up with you? What are you? What do you mean, what am I? one becomes difficult to place, because the church in this country has worked very hard for unity in a society torn by institutionalized racism that still exists. I myself was fortunate enough to be sent to what was, for all intents and purposes, an illegal school, because the nuns were, in a way, political activists. They made their schools multiracial when schools were divided. Whites went there, black people went there, those of mixed race had a different school system, those of Asian descent had a different school system. And the Catholic Church, and particularly the religious women, ran contra to that in opening their schools up to all races. And I was fortunate to have that kind of background. So to be a Catholic in a secular university has become, for me, almost to be a witness to the possibility of unity where there's division that is so deeply entrenched. People's mistrust and distrust still runs very deep, although we're almost 30 years past the first democratic elections, because it's fine and well to have democracy. It's fine and well to have a democratically elected president. But that's not going to resolve the fact that poverty and privilege do not disappear in that time. And sometimes the elite, I think, in countries like our own, are simply replaced. So there might be African people running the country, running business, but that doesn't filter down to the majority of people that we experience on the ground. As a deacon, then, with also this dual role as an academic and a deacon, the pastoral role would be seeing how people are, because the bulk of the Catholic Church in South Africa, we could say the Catholic Church in South Africa is an African church, which is good and beautiful. It's what it should be. But that also means we have to offer challenge to society, to the norms, against the norms of the institutions where racism would still be deeply embedded, or the inverse, where racism has somehow become reversed. So it isn't just between white and black. The feeling could be black to white as well, because of the injustices of the past. And the real sense of deprivation, the real sense of struggle that the majority of people in our country would experience. In this way, I think a country like Brazil would be very similar to our own, where we have a ruling elite and a bulk of people who are seriously struggling economically, where education is a huge privilege, and where university education too is something that only very few manage to reach. But in another sense, and this also speaks to my own Catholicity within, and my sense of social justice, which I think is rooted in Catholic social teaching. I teach in a distance learning university, and it's next year, I think it's next year, or the year after, it will celebrate its 150th anniversary. Was a university by correspondence before. And obviously, since the internet came in, it's no more by post, but through ICTs. We teach 400,000 students in our university, which is huge.
Gosh.
So that means we are providing for 400,000 people possibilities to education that they might not have in other universities because the cost is lower for them. And indeed, in philosophy, we teach something in the region of between 13 and, depending on the year, between 13 and 17, 18,000 students per year. We're exposing them to philosophy, which is fairly unusual. But yeah, so I think for
That's just
me,
extraordinary, just extraordinary. You've taught us all sorts of things already in just a few minutes. You know, my area of specialization is stray thoughts, and I've had 4 or 5 that do connect with this extraordinary story, true story you're telling us. One is, there's a young woman named Rebecca Ginsburg, who we've had on our program a couple of times, and who worked in South Africa. She's of a mixed race background, and she came to South Africa from Los Angeles, and she has subsequently written a book on the role of architecture during apartheid. And one of the themes she has is the front house and the back house, the front house and the back house. And now she's very much engaged in prison reform in the United States, and that's a reform we could certainly use. That's one stray thought. So we're not totally ignorant about South Africa, but she has returned to the United States. Another point, question I'd like to raise about your own background as a grad student and perhaps as a young professor, and even now. You mentioned Calvinism in passing, and who among us in the United States could not think of Alvin Plantinga, a premier Calvinist, one of the greatest Christian philosophers who makes no bones about his Christianity. And of course, some few of us, and note my last name is Dutch. I'm from Grand Rapids, and we have a bumper sticker in Grand Rapids that doesn't say Rome, Rum, and Rebellion. It says, if it ain't Dutch, it ain't much. I've been exposed to Cornelius Van Til. So I wonder if you ever ran across those two worthies, Plantinga and Van Til. And then the last thing I want to make, because contexts are so very, very different. A number of us here in the United States find a lot of tension being Catholic in Jesuit universities. So if you'd like to pick up any of those manifestly loose threads, I'd be very interested.
The difficulty of being a Catholic in a Jesuit university, I'm assuming.
Yes, that's one loose thread, although it threatens to strangle a good many people. And then the currents with Calvinism in the United States, Cornelius Van Til one, Alvin Plantinga another, some might say the Dominican order. I'm a nonpartisan critic. Someone like Professor Stephen Long, who writes on freedom, has often been charged with being a kind of crypto-Calvinist. And then ignore whatever you choose here. There's plenty to ignore. I'm also interested in why science, why philosophy of science?
Maybe that's the easiest question to begin with. Among these that you've asked. I suppose because when I began my graduate studies, I was in the milieu of Nietzsche's and You were either a Nietzschean or a Heideggerian. That's what they were.
Slim pickings.
Very. And I felt at home with neither. I guess from schooling, I once described to a Calvinist Thomist here, who wrote, an Afrikaans man, a former colleague, he's retired now. He wrote a book on nihilism and St. Thomas as the answer to nihilism, and it's essentially an encounter between Nietzsche and St. Thomas, but it's written in Afrikaans, which doesn't help many people unless you have reading knowledge of Dutch. However, I once said to him, I grew up with St. Thomas as a friend, because being in Dominican convent schools, there were statues of St. Thomas all over the place. Well, St. Dominic too, but of course he'd be less popular. And hearing stories from the religious women about Thomas. So going through 3 or 4 years of secular philosophy, I was always looking for God. There was not a course taught on philosophy of religion. We were exposed to philosophy, a bit of ancient Greek philosophy, a bit of political philosophy here and there, but really focusing on philosophical hermeneutics, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Gadamer, and then Foucault and the rest. And I felt that I didn't find God much in what was being taught. And perhaps because of that, I felt more drawn to philosophy of science. And in philosophy of science as an undergrad, we began to be exposed to different models of cosmology and questions like, why is there something rather than nothing, and basic metaphysics, which really sparked an interest for me. And in a way, you're limited. You're largely limited by those who are teaching you to what you become interested in. So somehow the interest in philosophy of science was a back door into big questions that had always been important for me. Why is there something rather than nothing? What is this issue about causality? Questions that I found in postmodernity, they simply were not asking. Bigger questions that were just being ignored. So I found solace in philosophy of science, and then in particular, I was fortunate to have lived with a Capuchin who had spent a good number of years in Berkeley, and he was I might be shot, I don't know. He was friends with Brian Swim and this passionist fellow, Thomas Berry. This idea of creation theology, and he taught science and religion for a time in Berkeley. I think it was at, what is it, the GTU?
Yes.
Yeah.
Graduate Theological Union.
Yeah, he taught there for a bit and then came here. He was an Irish friar, and he had vast books on a vast collection of books on cosmology, the story of the universe. He would have known Father Coyle and Brother Consolmagno and these sorts of people. He had also been the Capuchin's head of justice, peace, and integrity of creation in Rome for about 7 years. So he had met quite a number of the Jesuits from the Vatican Observatory. And so through him, I got interested in cosmology. But that link then between cosmology and the big questions of metaphysics directed me into philosophy of science. that led me then in my doctoral work to write on the idea of the unity of truth in St. Thomas made manifest in the dialogue between science and faith. And somehow in my doctoral work, these different strands of interest that I had came together in seeing fundamentally that an item of truth can never contradict something else which is true. So where my companions in the university, who were mostly Calvinists, were scared of science, I found that within the church there was not fear of science at all. There was openness to science, and I suspected that it came from St. Thomas's own exposure to science, to traditions that differed from what would have been dominant in his day, and that he had access to the best scholarship of his own time. I found that rather inspiring. So, yeah, my doctoral work was developing a Thomist ontological epistemology that would be a way of bringing science and faith together, in particular looking at these boundary questions that are not properly questions of science, but strangely enough, which scientists seemed to be asking a lot more than theologians were. And I had met, during the time of my doctoral research, I was in Cambridge for a little bit. I met John Polkinghorne, I met Father George Coyne, I met Father Tanzela Niti from the Holy Cross University, Santa Croce in Rome, and began to see, as I was trying to figure out in my doctoral research, what was going to be the contribution of my study. Isn't it the most difficult question for doctoral students is precisely that. And I sat in a conference listening to scientists and theologians, both speaking about the same thing, but flying past each other. They weren't able to speak a common language, and so they were missing each other all the time. And then it came to me, the linchpin was in philosophy. So I had my idea and worked on that. So the two came together. But in my life, I think what's been interesting in that sense is the connection between my academic interest in science, especially at that point, and my faith journey. The two were not two separate journeys. They were happening at the same time and touching each other, which was, I think, a great privilege. Now where I find myself is in something that you mentioned it, or in the set of questions it was mentioned about the Thomist Congress that I attended. I don't know if the Angelicum is a Calvinist university or not. I'll have to ask Father Thomas Joseph the next time I see him. But Pope Francis, when we had our audience with him, spoke off the cuff, and it amazed me quite how clear he was in his understanding of St. Thomas. He put his speech aside and simply spoke. And one of the points that he said was, know Thomas as Thomas is, but make Thomas relevant to the world of today, to today's questions, to the context that you find yourself in. And engage with him with the problems of today's world. I had it here opened in front of me. He said, to us, the Christian is not afraid to initiate a sincere, rational dialogue with the culture of their own time. And for me, that spoke very greatly to precisely something which I had been working on, because in South Africa at the moment, the philosophical move is very much towards decoloniality. The attempt, well, maybe not an attempt to rid philosophy of Western thinking, but at least to re-embrace the traditional philosophies of the people. Of course, influenced by Latin America very, very strongly, but not to do what the Latin Americans have been doing. And I found myself a few years ago saying, okay, here I am teaching philosophy in a secular university. I proclaim to be a Thomist. Of what relevance is Thomism to where I am now? So that led me into making an argument, a kind of retrospective argument, that St. Thomas could himself be seen as a decolonial scholar by virtue of the fact that he was open to other traditions. His openness to the Arab world, for example, openness to traditions that the church wasn't too much in favor of in his time. And recently I have been looking at a point of intersection between St. Thomas and African philosophy. Because again, it's about trying to find relevance and trying to see how different traditions might assist and help one another to grow. This is why I was so moved by what the Pope was saying. Look at the context. Here in South Africa, one of the key ideas that forms culture but is at the root of African philosophy in Southern Africa is the idea of Ubuntu. That a person, it comes from an Nguni expression, which is the family of languages that the isiZulu language, isiXhosa, isiNdebele, and Siswati, the language of what was Swaziland, would express. A person is a person through other people. Our humanity depends upon others, and we are formed to be who we are through others. And without others, my existence almost ceases. I began to contemplate this and to think, where would there be, or is there any kind of parallel between St. Thomas and this idea? Because I'm quite interested in the idea that regardless of particular contextual traditions, there are frequent overlaps between world philosophies. People somehow come to similar realizations of what can be valued, what is valued. And I found this link in St. Thomas's idea of mutual indwelling, that you can love the person to such a degree that your being and the being of the other dwell together. It's very similar to the idea of Ubuntu. So that's something that I've been working on recently, when I can, because most of my work is teaching, and the unfortunate part of teaching is marking. The less romantic part of being
The thrills never end there. The thrills never end. Now, you've mentioned many things with regard to culture that I know Mario has an intense interest in. Mario, could you bring us forward?
Well, you said in passing something that caught my attention about Latin America. I know that has been for years an issue in Latin America, whether or not the continent had a philosophy proper to the continent. And you said that that view or that issue is somehow similar to what is you are dealing with in South Africa. Would you mind elaborating a little bit about that, if you could?
Within African philosophy, the question of whether or not there is such a thing as African philosophy was much debated about in earlier decades. I think we are now past that question being asked. It's true that the philosophical tradition within the continent of Africa might not have been written down because the cultures would value orality in a much greater way than cultures of the West would. Story, identity, history is often passed on, and wisdom is often passed on through proverb, through song, and songs and stories, storytelling that's told through generations, from one generation to the next. The question of whether or not such a thing as African philosophy exists would no longer be a question at all. And I think that to a large extent we have to thank Catholics for that. If you think, for example, of the Flemish missionary to Congo, Franciscan Sebastian Tempels, he wrote, not Sebastian Tempels, that was somebody else, Temples. Anyway, I can't think of his first name now. He wrote a book on what he called Bantu philosophy very early on in the last century. And it was a kind of ethno-philosophical study using what he observed as a missionary in Congo. But he certainly observed that there was a wisdom tradition in that particular place. Placide Tempels, my apologies, was his name. That same quest continued in the work of Rwandan philosopher, also a Catholic priest, Kagame, Alexis Kagame, who did his doctorate in Louvain, where he was using etymology to prove that there was indeed philosophical discourse happening. Now, some people have accused both Tempels and Kagame of being scholastics in hiding in the methodology that they used to determine and to detect that there is such a thing as African philosophy. I wouldn't necessarily say that, because neither of them would acknowledge that this was their method necessarily. But certainly there was a sensitivity on the part of missionaries, although Kagame was an African, he wasn't a missionary, but certainly there was an attempt to look to see whether there is indeed a philosophical tradition happening. But I think where we are now is in a place that's more open. We can do philosophy that's relevant to Africa, utilizing both the tools that have come from the Western tradition and linking these to the problems that we find within the African context. This becomes contextual philosophy relative to where we are here. But then again, we shouldn't forget the argument of Black Athena, that the Greeks themselves were influenced by the Egyptians. And this argument seems to me to hold some weight. I have not gone too much into it, but I've read the books and read the arguments and so on. It seems there was an engagement between the Greeks and Egypt, and some sense of metaphysics, some sense of political system, some sense of logic, very much. Yeah. So I think we've passed, as I said, we've passed asking the question of whether there is a philosophical tradition. We now accept that there is, but at the same time, I think something that has to be borne in mind in the process of the popularity of these decolonial movements that are, well, I mean, I know it's Latin American in origin, but it's also embraced very strongly in Africa and in the last 5 to 10 years. I think that we need to bear in mind that there's no going back. There's no going back to any idealized form of how people lived in pre-colonial times, because this is where we find ourselves. The ideal, whatever the ideal might have been, has been watered down by people bumping up against each other and culture taking on a form that is what it is at this minute. And here, I think we run not a risk, but we sit in a situation where culture is radically becoming very much westernized, precisely because I said at the very beginning, people's exposure to the world and wanting to be what they see on television or in movies and so on, and even in accents that people would utilize, the way in which words would be spoken. My wife is a high school teacher, and she often complains that these children are speaking like Americans because they copy the accents, and particularly African American accents. A word like ask that becomes axe. And people here, young people here, have adopted that now.
Well, it'd be all right if they copied Midwestern accents.
With Dutch backgrounds.
Yes. Well, you know,
I found
we're coming disturbingly close to the end, and there are 87 more things to ask. And some of them are central and some of them are not so central. So I'll try to focus on the central ones. You know how teachers like to have a question that begins compare and contrast? How about compare and contrast the church in South Africa and the church in Nigeria?
I answered this question without knowing and without having ever been to Nigeria, but there are many Nigerians here in South Africa. So
and in California, many of our parishes have Nigerian priests. Many of them.
Yeah, we have also that reality. I think what would be fundamentally different would be the strength of the church in Nigeria compared to the strength of the church in South Africa. There would be many more Catholic Nigerians than there would be Catholics in South Africa. They're about 10%, I think, and we are 7, but in total population, I think there's 20 million Catholics in Nigeria. They certainly wouldn't have an issue with vocations. Seminaries, for example, would be full. It's anecdotal, but I met in Rome a Nigerian priest who would be in his 50s, and he was doing his second doctorate or something at the Urbaniana, and he said, well, I'm here because I'll only ever get a parish when I'm about 65, because most parishes have 5 curates. So that would be very different to us. So we struggle with vocations. This doesn't mean that the church is not alive, but our seminaries would not be full. Religious life would not be vibrant as it is in Nigeria. They have many young sisters that they're able to send out We don't have that. But on the negative side, what I have experienced is Nigerian clerics are naturally extraordinarily clerical and would be very, very much not in favor with the style of church that the Holy Father is calling us to. What happens then is when they come to a country like South Africa, which, although being on the African continent, is strongly influenced by the West, you have people who ask questions within parishes. And so what Father says is not always right. And this can cause huge conflicts in the pastoral setting when there are Nigerian clerics here. I don't think they adapt very well to this context. It is different, very different for them. Also, I think the influence that the Catholic Church in South Africa would have perhaps on politics, or the deference that might be given to bishops in Nigeria, would certainly not be the case here. So if the Bishops' Conference here would issue a statement, as it does frequently on matters of social justice, my feeling is the government does not really take much notice of what the Church has to say, because Church is tolerated as a right, faith is a right, of course, but its place is not in relation to the state. I think in Nigeria it would not be like that. And in other African countries, if for example in the DRC, Congo, the Church has massive influence on the state, and bishops especially. They are revered. Their example, what they say, how they critique things, would be taken very, very seriously. Here, not so much. So we are in a very secularized country, and we do find that missionaries who come to South Africa, whether it's from India, we have many Indian priests here and women religious, or from Nigeria, from Kenya, and so on. I think they do struggle with the fact that in society, you're just not that important if you're a cleric. You're just somebody else. Get to the back of the line, because just because you're here and we are here doesn't mean you should be in front because you're a cleric. This sort of attitude, which might not be bad.
Mario, first of all, technical question. Can you go 5 minutes longer?
Okay.
You know, students hate to miss your thoughts, but they might manage for 5 minutes. All right, you're up, sir. You're up. What do you think about what you've just been hearing?
Are you talking to me?
You betcha.
Okay. Well, when you were talking about the context and the South African context and African philosophy, in Latin America, there has been a criticism about Thomism. Now, I'm not going to get into what type of Thomism are we talking about here. There were few types, but generally has been accused of being precisely foreign to the context. So much so that the issue of Latin American philosophy, which began in 19th century, was proposed by what we may call today classical liberals. And Thomism was the foreign philosophy was imposed on Latin America by Spain, by the Kingdom of Spain. And the issues dealing with the issue that Thomists deal with are generally abstract issues, not political issues. They were generally against what we call liberal democracy. They were pretty much in favor of an idea of the old Christendom and all that. And so when the Pope says, I think correctly, when we have to deal with the issue of today, we have to answer. I think he was right on target. Now, that hasn't been the tradition of Thomism, generally speaking. What would you say about that?
It's
What would
something
be-
I found. Sorry, Mario.
No, it's okay.
It's something I found to be interesting when I was at the Thomist Congress at the Angelicum recently. There was very few papers presented that dealt with real issues, with real things that affect people's lives, or even with contemporary problems. I found it to be very heavily, in a sense, almost exegetical Thomism, or something like that, which I found, and I was sharing with some other people from Africa who were there, that I found this very very odd, because it was so disconnected from any reality that I think would impact people's lives, whether it's in a pastoral context or in an academic context here. It's for that reason that I have been trying in the last number of years to work specifically at looking at issues where St. Thomas can speak to current problems, current situations, or current contexts. That task has taken various forms, but I think the same critique has been seen by many people in Africa. Of course, for the most part, I think here Thomism has been taught properly or more fully in the seminary situation, rather than in the world of secular universities, where Thomas is mentioned in an introductory course to the history of Western philosophy in passing as a figure to look at, and he happened to be important in the 13th century, and that's it. Of course, in the seminaries it would have been a bit more recognized, but my understanding is that the two were taught in parallel to each other, but very seldom touching. You had to know Thomas because you need to know the mind of the church, but then, for instance, here in the 80s, as the church was very much standing in opposition to apartheid, the seminaries would have begun teaching African philosophy, which wasn't being taught in the state universities. There would have been some priests who would have been experts in African philosophy, some former seminarians. A colleague of mine, Professor Ramos-Reyes, went to study in Belgium at Louvain and taught African philosophy strongly. It's interesting, however, in the sense that quite a number of the African philosophers are or were practicing Catholics who would have understood well St. Thomas. And when you listen in between the lines, you begin to see, aha, St. Thomas is there, St. Thomas is there, St. Thomas is there, in the way that they express themselves or the way that they view the world. And that, I don't think, could be said of Calvinists who would have perhaps become philosophers, that there would have been any link between their faith tradition and the work that they were doing. The church very definitely had to take a stand. One of the ways of doing that was through how it trained its clergy, so the openness. But indeed, the the Thomism being taught, I don't think often linked to any reality, and probably doesn't at all. And maybe that's why, or any existential situation, and maybe that's why here in South Africa at the minute, we have myself working in Thomism. There's another fellow at Rhodes University in Grahamstown, and a Nigerian Kiltegan father who teaches in one of the seminaries. I think we would be the three who are active, and one retired philosopher who was a Dominican before. But interestingly enough, there was another former Dominican called Augustin Schut, who wrote a book on African philosophy in the 90s, which was a very progressive book for its time, yet he was a Thomist writing on African philosophy. So I think if we are to be true to St. Thomas and to St. Thomas's openness, in being open as he was to Jewish philosophers, to Muslim philosophers in his own day, and then applying that to the particular tradition and context that he found himself in, we probably should be doing the same. And that means less of an exegetical kind of Thomism and more of a Thomism that links to the actual realities that people are experiencing. However, the problem might be, and here's where I often find myself asking, Thomas, although I don't think he's a typical Western philosopher in the sense that he predates categorization, and he was so open to receiving the philosophies of Ramos-Reyes and Avicenna, Maimonides, and so on. He wasn't strictly Western at all. There's an openness to other traditions, and an openness to traditions that might have been able to respond to particular questions with greater thoroughness than what he was surrounded by. And it's impossible just to categorize him as Aristotelian. In fact, at the Thomistic Congress, Rudy Tefelde upset quite a number of Dominicans by arguing that St. Thomas could be seen as a Platonist. But, maybe he made the Augustinians happy. But I think looking at St. Thomas seriously, his own openness to other traditions challenges me in this context, not just to remain with him. He provides a method, and certainly from the perspective of faith provides a rigorous method of how to get to God, but how to do that within my particular situation, whether it be relating science to faith, or relating an aspect of St. Thomas's philosophical anthropology to a dimension of African philosophy's anthropology. Certainly what it speaks to is a wisdom that transcends culture and transcends particularity, but which is fundamentally human. I think that's the direction that philosophy should be going in, where we are able to recognize the true and the good and the beautiful across cultures, across traditions. World philosophy, perhaps this is the future of philosophy, but I think St. Thomas gives us a good foundation in doing that.
What?
Of course, I'm in substantial agreement with the positions that you present. At the same time, I'd like to close, as philosophy does, with some critical questions. Joseph Pieper points out, as have others, that Greek philosophy began in a kind of interrogation of the religious heritage of the Greeks. And that had there not been this theological context, that the Greek philosophers wouldn't have had anything to cut their teeth on, as it were. Now, application to African philosophy. We've heard many times the emphasis on community, on narrative, and we certainly have strains of that in contemporary American philosophy, very definitely so. But there is this critical question. Yes, you tell this story and you tell that story. To what extent are these stories true? That is, to what extent do these stories connect with the character of the human enterprise? It's not as if one can move from argument to story and somehow lift off into the land of complete agreement. That's not the case. There's going to be that critical element always, and that has to be something that philosophers don't try to pretend isn't part of their repertoire. And with regard to independent Thomists and their exegetical dimension and their practical dimension, though she's not oftentimes taken to be a Thomist, Elizabeth Anscombe drew heavily on Thomistic themes. She did really good work in the history of philosophy. Some of her last work was actually on St. Anselm. At the same time, no one could have more strongly engaged the culture in which she found herself. For example, she sharply opposed giving any kind of an honorary degree to Harry Truman, claiming literally that he was a mass murderer. And though it wasn't picked up in The Spectator or The Guardian, she was physically engaged in Operation Rescue, blocking the doors of abortion centers. And so I think that she's an extraordinary person for us to consider. And the last thought is, you mentioned the Holy Father and Father Thomas White. And, well, I wonder if someday the Holy Father won't bestow upon us an account of how Thomas wasn't a casuist, when in fact he clearly was a casuist in many, many areas, and we richly draw on the casuistry that the Holy Father seems to ex cuffo dismiss. Now, with regard to Thomas White, God love him, you know, he's a hillbilly Thomist, among other things. He's very engaged with the culture. However, as Rector Magnificus, he issued the strongest denunciation of the Russian attack on Ukraine, while completely ignoring in public, as does Francis, the blatant destruction of Uyghur culture in China. If we're going to be open to Muslims, we ought not to ignore this gross violation of human rights carried out by the Chinese regime in the land of the Uyghurs. I don't know the appropriate stan that it's in. I know it's not Uyghur-stan. I've never heard that. So, as I warned you, we oftentimes end in a rant, and I'll be satisfied with your polite nod and smile, and we end at the end of the session always with what really matters, the gospel of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And so today's gospel is as follows. Jesus said to the crowds, "Everything that the Father gives me will come to me, and I will not reject anyone who comes to me, because I came down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of the one who sent me. And this is the will of the one who sent me, that I should not lose anything of what he gave me, but that I should raise it up on the last day. For this is the will of my Father, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have eternal life, and I shall raise him up on the last day." Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
We need
All Mario students have run out of the classroom.
we need another encounter about Thomism and politics.
Yes. Yes.
We need that.
Something to think about.
Okay.
Godspeed,
Good.
good friend. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for
Take
your
care,
time.
Professor.